We have a change in program today. I hope it will not surprise too many of you. We're going to talk about something different than the schedule shows. We're going to talk about the American CIA and the Soviet KGB. These are the two major intelligence agencies of our generation, of our century. So we need to know something about them. We never had anything like the CIA for years and years and decades, and then a century, and then another century. We almost had one in World War II when we woke up finally that we had a problem. So it's called the OSS. It was formed by a bunch of Yale people, Yale Brahmins, that is. Is that your cell phone that I hear ringing? Oy vey. So, how did this all come about? Well, in the 1920s, we had a man who served in government, and he discovered that the US Navy was trying to break the Japanese code. And this came over as a great surprise. And he ordered them to cease and desist and to destroy what they had already discovered. So there we went through the 1920s without any knowledge of what really was going on in Asia, given the rise of Japan as a major military power. Then Franklin Roosevelt came to power. You remember him, the guy who ran the country for 4 times elected president. And he put together a rather famous group. He wanted it to be a coalition government, so he put as many Republicans in his administration as he did Democrats. And one of the Republicans was this famous, again, New England Brahmin, who had made a decision to destroy our effort to make use of the Japanese code. This time, when he was asked about it, he simply said, well, you know, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. But in this case, these people are not gentlemen. And so we began to work on the code system. It actually turned out to our benefit. If you remember anything about the war at all, there was a famous Japanese admiral. He had been an attaché, naval attaché for Japan in Washington. And he'd warned the Japanese not to go to war with America, because if they did, they would find a sleeping tiger and they would really pay dearly. As you know, they paid at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in the destruction of the Japanese home government. And they also found out that we knew, by breaking the code, exactly where the famous admiral who warned them was going to be. And in this particular case, we went up in the air and found him flying in the South Pacific, and we destroyed him by shooting his airplane down. So you could find all kinds of things that were really horrible about the war, and part of them was what we were doing with the OSS. Now the OSS, this organization that was formed in World War II for us to fight with as an intelligence agency, did a lot of things that were good. They, for instance, arranged secretly for the surrender of the German army in Italy. And so Air Marshal Kesselring surrendered to the man who was in charge, who was a very young Allen Dulles, and the Italian war was over. Sometimes they didn't do such good things. For instance, the Mafia had almost been destroyed in Italy, and the reason they came alive again was because of us. We decided that the Mafia was a good tool against the German High Command, and so we supported them in Naples and in the boot of Italy. And so we have the Mafia on our side. Later we will pay a terrible price for that. And we also had the OSS working with Kesselring. So at the end of the war, because we want to get on with this. Harry Truman was president by accident. Franklin Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman made the decision to get rid of the OSS, that we did not need an intelligence agency in this country. So he got rid of the OSS in 1945, and we were eyeless in Gaza. That is, we had no intelligence way of looking at the country and the world that looked behind the curtain. It took 2 years for Americans to wake up. It often takes us many, many years to wake up. In this case, there was a major reform that remade the United States for all time. In 1947, the National Defense Act was passed with Truman backing it. And in the National Defense Act of 1947, we created the Central Intelligence Agency. We also created the Defense Department, and we put inside the Defense Department, the Department of the Navy, Department of the Army, and a new Department of Air Force, so that we had to begin to realize that we had to revamp ourselves for the world to come. So we have a CIA and a Department of Defense, a DOD, and then we have other agencies, particularly the Office of the Secretary of Defense, since there had been no OSF before. So with these instruments, we went off to fight the Cold War. The CIA was born, a small agency out in the hills of Northern Virginia in Langley, and they began to work. The head of the CIA initially was Allen Dulles, the man who in OSS terms had got the German High Command in Italy to surrender. He was very successful, and his brother was soon Secretary of State because he became the Secretary of State when the Republicans took over the White House. So we were okay. We finally got ourselves up to speed. In the case of the Russians, they never ever were without an intelligence agency. They had them in the Tsar's day. So you have a very difficult tale to tell of the Soviets. In the days before there was the Soviet Union, there was Imperial Russia, but even the Tsar needed agents. You might know there was a Tsar in the middle of the 19th century who was assassinated. It is not a good sign for security. You also might know that there was a Tsar in the middle of the 19th century who also released all of the Tsar's subjects that were serfs and gave them their freedom, which was something that he did as a great liberator for the Russian people, the Russian serfs, several years before Lincoln freed the slaves in our country. So it's an upside and downside story of what the Soviet Union was going to become. But when the Soviets did take charge, they had a terrible time getting control. Maybe some of you know the story and some of you don't. The Germans were fighting a very bad war called World War I, and they were losing. So they decided to upset the Russian forces by smuggling a revolutionary named Lenin, who was then living in Switzerland, all the way across Eastern Europe in a sealed boxcar, and then taking him to Helsinki and then putting him on a train to the Finland station, which is the name of a very famous book. And so this man, known as Lenin, does in fact make it to the Finland station, which is the station that services St. Petersburg, soon to be Leningrad, and he sets up a new empire there, the one you call the Soviet Union. So in that process, the Soviets, and before that the Russians, had always had an intelligence agency. The Soviets are now going to have what we call the KGB, the Commissariat for State Security. And we're going to have the CIA, and they're going to become the major features of the world that you live in to this very day. I don't know if you know anything about Mr. Putin, who is now the head of the Russian government or the Soviet government. But Putin is basically a product of the KGB. He was a KGB officer. His last big assignment was in Dresden, which is a big East German city. It used to be in East Germany alone as a major Soviet city. And Putin worked there for many, many years, and he speaks German with a very heavy Saxon accent. Saxony is where Dresden is located, and that's why when he meets with the famous and duly famous German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they both recognize each other because they're both speaking Saxon German. So you have those two features of the landscape. Now let me tell you something about those landscapes. I'll tell you a story. There was in East Germany a very famous intelligence agency. It was set up by the KGB to be a model of theirs. It organized something called the Romeo Spies. This was a series of very good-looking Germans, looked like they were Olympic athletes, and they were sent across from East Germany to West Germany as the famous Romeo group. That is, they were to meet West German women who were employed by the German government, and they were to romance them and lead them into being spies in name as well as in deed. Now, the great problem with this plan was it worked. And at the same time, the German state, which we created, by the way, I know many people think that somehow Konrad Adenauer just appeared on the scene. When Konrad Adenauer, a very old man, the Altair, was alive living in Hitler's Germany, and he was on the Gestapo's wanted list. And they were about to arrest him when the war came to an end. So we, the Americans, discovered him, de Altair, and made him Chancellor of the new West Germany, the West Germany comprised of French-occupied Germany, British-occupied Germany, and American-occupied Germany. It became the German Federal Republic, which is its name today now that it is united. So all looked good. The problem was, as the years went by, things began to change. The plot worked as far as the East German intelligence agency, the Stasi by name. To give you a feeling for it, the Stasi had more agents working for them than the Gestapo had agents working for the whole of Nazi Germany. So that can show you the very thorough police state that had been built. And the Stasi continued their control, and they continued this plan to run these Romeo agents, which were pretty successful. Low level, they were dating secretaries that worked at the government. The government in those days was at Bonn, the city famous for Beethoven. That's the city Beethoven was born in. And Bonn was then the capital of the German Federal Republic. Unfortunately, time did go by, and the German people suddenly decided to elect a new chancellor, this time not appointed by the Americans. And this guy was not from the old party. The old party is the Christian Democrats, the CDU, the party of Konrad Adenauer, and also the party of the man who followed him, Ludwig Erhard, who was a great finance minister. But now suddenly the German people were going to take on a new man, a wonderful new man, a Burgermeister from Berlin, no less. And he was elected. So among the German people, you have CDU, the party of the right, SPD, the party of the left, FDP, the party of the intellectuals, very small party. And now today you also have the Green Party, 4 parties, not just 2. So you have this man coming from Berlin to be a Bürgermeister in Bonn. He's a man who is highly respected, and he is the man who sends a very important European signal. He goes to Eastern Europe and says to all the Eastern European people that Germany had assaulted during the war and promised not to claim the lost lands of the German people. Much of Germany had been lost during World War II at the end of the war. So the cities like Danzig, which used to be a great German city on the Baltic, cities like Königsberg, the ancient capital of Prussia, were all lost. Let me tell you how you lose a city. In the case of Königsberg, the great city capital of Prussia, every German speaker was moved out of that city, and everyone was transferred far away. And then all the new people who came in to live there were Russians. So it's now called Kaliningrad, not Königsberg. And it's a great Russian city. And even after the end of the Cold War, it's still a major Russian city as a small enclave surrounded by the Estonia, Latvia people, the Baltic nations. So you have this tremendous change, and you have a mayor from Berlin, who's now chancellor, saying, we will not claim any of those lands back. We lost them. You have moved the borders. We recognize the borders for what they are, and we plan to live within the borders as they are now. This was the message that the Soviets very much wanted to hear, because it assured them that the borders that they had created, the borders of the new Europe, were the permanent borders for the Europe to come. Unfortunately, there was a secretary who was working in the Chancellor's office in Bonn, and this secretary had been contacted by one of these Romeo lovers and had become her lover. So now we have somebody going crazy in the hallway. I think they will now be quiet. We have the Chancellor's office involved in the Romeo scheme, and the news breaks. So what do you have? It's now apparent that Willy Brandt's government has been infiltrated by an agent provocateur who works for the East Germans, for the communists. And so Willy Brandt's government falls. Well, the KGB went crazy. They could not believe that their subordinates in the East had done this to them by destroying one of the major things that was an achievement of the Soviet Union, to get the borders straight by being as foolish as outing somebody who was in the Chancellor's office. But so it did happen. And so what you have is the government in Bonn falls, a new government comes to power, and the government of Willy Brandt is disgraced because it's assumed that she must have told secrets that were known only to the Americans, and maybe a little bit to the British and a little bit to the French. So again, we have another medley of songs. Thank you. So, where were we? We're about Willy Brandt and his government falling from power, the KGB very unhappy with this whole set of procedures, and trying to work this whole thing out was this new American group, the CIA, who was startled to find that this had occurred, given we had made Bonn our major ally in Europe, and we had decided that we would trust them with our greatest secrets, and now suddenly it turned out the secrets were perhaps known to the Soviets. So what to do about all of that? Well, there wasn't very much we could do for damage control, because what we had done, not only had we created in Germany a German CIA called the B&D, we had created little CIAs all over the world. For instance, I see a man who's looking at me now from the audience who is Korean. We set up a Korean CIA, KCIA. That really backfired on us because there was a power grab in Korea using the CIA to take over Seoul and run the government there. We also had other groups that we worked with that were very problematic. Let me tell you another story. There once was a man, terrible man. He escaped Germany at the end of World War II. He was a Nazi. He got to Argentina, thought he was hidden away. He waited in Argentina, but there was a group who were determined to find him, and they did. The group is modeled on our CIA. It's called the Mossad. It's the Israeli intelligence agency. So the Mossad planned in a very detailed recapture. They arrived by surprise in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. They knew the farmhouse he was located in outside of Buenos Aires. They hit the farmhouse, they found him, they grabbed him, and they dragged him all the way back to Israel, and they tried him, and they executed him. He had been a major figure in the Holocaust, which represented the death of 6 million Jews to the Israelis. The Mossad is very, very fickle about who it shares things with. And to give you a current example, they gave us some leading intelligence about the Middle East, and they gave it to Mr. Trump, assuming Mr. Trump would know how to handle it. And instead, Mr. Trump sat openly in his little place down in Miami, discussing this intelligence with lots of people, within earshot of many people. So when the Mossad found about that, that was the end of the contribution of Israeli intelligence with the United States of America. There was no way to trust this man, and after he had been trusted, why trust anybody at all in America who were so loose that they would talk about sensitive. The idea of what he was talking about, by the way, was involved people who were agents for the Israelis, and those agents died. That is, Israel shared with us sensitive information about some agents of theirs located in and around Damascus. And when the stuff was leaked, the Syrians learned about it, captured and murdered the agents that the Israelis were running in Damascus. So you see, it can be a very difficult. Let me give you another example. For some strange reason, long ago and far away, the Roman Catholic Church decided to elect a Polish pope. And this infuriated the Soviets because Poland was on their border, and Poland was the one area they had chosen not to eliminate the influence of the Catholic Church, and now they felt this was a betrayal. So what did they do? They went to their Bulgarian clients and had a client selected to assassinate the Pope. And the Pope was in fact shot. Trouble was the Bulgarians were lousy shots, and all they did was wound the Pope. And when the Pope survived, he then forgave the man who shot him, which was a double insult as far as the Soviets were concerned. Not only had they hired a man who wasn't a good shot, then the Pope himself forgives them for what they had done. So those playing back and forth with this game made it very difficult. Now let me tell you another little story that'll get you a feeling for this. In the case of the East Germans, they were very effective. They had this organization that was more powerful than the Gestapo had been. And they had been running these Romeo agents for some time. Then it all blew up in their face with the guy who was then involved with a woman who was a Romeo agent. The girl was involved with him. So the question then was what to do about all these numbered areas. Now we had already made it clear that we knew that most of the world had very, very special intelligence agencies. You go to France today and you find that there is a Deuxième Bureau and a Sécurité, and they run a very tight ship. The French are different than we are in many, many ways. I'll give you another little example. Years ago, a very good-looking Frenchman worked in the French embassy in Moscow. He was targeted by the Russian KGB, and they figured they could get him and entrap him. So he was enticed by a very good-looking Siberian blonde to come to her apartment. And he went there. Turned out the apartment was totally bugged. The chairs were bugged. The bedroom was bugged. The bed was bugged. The ceiling was bugged. Every place you could have a camera. And so it was, the night went on, and the next day the Frenchman left the apartment of the Siberian blonde, and around 2 weeks later, he was contacted by a member of the KGB who was acting as a member of the Russian government, and they met, and he slid a piece of paper in which there were located several very naughty films. And they were films of this man in his amorous hours with his blonde. And the Frenchman then said, "Sacre bleu, mon Dieu, magnifique. I would like a second copy of these films to show my friends because they'll never believe this." And the agent couldn't believe his ears. Here was a Frenchman who was not going to fall for the trap. So the agent went back, that is the Frenchman, to his own ambassador and said, "I think I have a problem and I'm the cause of it." And the ambassador said, "Well, that's all right. It's your time to leave Russia anyway. You can go back to Paris for your assignment at home." And to show you that the French have a very different attitude about what you can do and what you can't do. This guy is back at the Quai d'Orsay, that's the French Foreign Ministry. And he's invited with others to a major reception at the Élysée Palace. That's the home of the French president. And the French president in those days was Charles de Gaulle, who was a very devout Roman Catholic. Nevertheless, he went, and he went down the receiving line, and de Gaulle looked at him in the eyes and he said, "I hear that you've been busy in bed," and let it go at that. And so what you have is basically a very non-American view of what you might call love life among the Europeans. And so they marched on, the Sécurité and the Deuxième Bureau. Also the same thing happened in London. MI5 and MI6 were the great British agencies for undercover work. And they are responsible for one of the major classic disasters of American politics. It turned out that we had elected an Irishman, you might remember him, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he had a press secretary named Pierre Salinger. And Pierre Salinger was asked one day, what does the president do for light reading? He can't work all the time. In fact, his brother Bobby has told us that they are not very busy in the White House. And Salinger decided to tell the story. He said, well, the president very much likes to read. And they said, well, what is he reading? And he said, oh, he was reading these spy books by Ian Fleming. And they went and looked up, and those spy books were called 007 James Bond, Ian Fleming's famous series of novels, which became then very, very famous movies, which everybody went to see. In fact, I was left a huge collection of films by a woman who is now deceased, and among the many, there's over 900 films, there's at least 40 or at least 30 James Bond films, From Russia with Love, Dr. No, on and on it goes. So what you had is a case of a president who in his spare reading time liked to read adventurous stories that involved a special agent by the name of James Bond with a very serious license to kill. Now, this would have been all right, except that the Kennedy brothers took these things rather seriously, and they liked the idea of messing in the area of espionage. So it was that Kennedy got himself involved in a tragedy. We had, in the case of the growing disaster known as the Vietnam War, a person who we did not like any longer as our as our toady president of Vietnam, South Vietnam. So we sent a very clear message to our ambassador in Saigon, who happened to be, for cover's sake, Cabot Lodge, who was a Republican. So the Kennedys were very wise in the way of politics, and they knew if something went wrong, they could help blame the Republicans. After all, it was a Republican who was ambassador. And it did go wrong. Kennedy had set it up so that there would be a coup, and the coup would overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, and in his place install someone who was more receptive to how we felt about the problems there. The problems were manifold. Number one, South Vietnam was basically a Buddhist country. Number two, the Ngo Dinh Diem family were Roman Catholics. This did not set well with the Buddhists, who are now demonstrating against Ngo Dinh Diem. So one way to settle things was to get rid of Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and to put a Buddhist in charge who would then be representative of the majority of the people. The problem was Diem wouldn't go. The problem was Diem heard about the attempted coup. He fled the palace. He was living in the Jardin section of Old Saigon. He fled down into the Cholan section, which was the Chinese section of the city, and he went and sought asylum in the cathedral. This is all very fateful because T.S. Eliot had just written a brilliant play. They didn't play New York, they did play London, called Murder in the Cathedral, in which a king wanted to get rid of an archbishop, and he did, and it resulted in the murder of the archbishop. Very famous story in English history. And now this tragedy was repeating itself again. We were going to launch a coup against an elected official, even if the election was slightly poisoned, and he would be overthrown. And Kennedy had told Henry Cabot Lodge that to tell the brothers, the Diem brothers, that we would give them refuge abroad. They would go outside of Vietnam. We would find them a place to live as refugees, and they'd live well. Well, it didn't work out that way. The colonels who were plotting this coup back at Tan Son Nhut, the big Air Force base outside of Saigon, didn't trust No Diem Diem. And so they arrived at the cathedral in an armored personnel carrier. They took the people in, the two brothers, closed the back of the armored personnel carrier, drove it from Cholan back to Tan Son Nhut Air Base. And when they brought the back of the carrier down so that you could see, there were two dead bodies inside. Both No Diem Diem and his brother had been stabbed at least a dozen times, and they'd been shot 2 or 3 times. This was to make sure they were deader than dead. And so when the word arrived back in the White House, the coup was basically successful, except there had been a tragic mistake and the two brothers were dead. Kennedy realized then that he was involved in the murder of a foreign leader, and he left the White House Situation Room. He was blank white because it all dawned on him that it had all gone awry, and that in the long run he would be blamed for this, and he was. Of course, he was soon dead himself in Dallas, but that's another tragedy. So you can see when people play at this espionage game, they have to be very, very careful. And it continued to go bad for him. That is, Kennedy had earlier already had a run-in with the CIA. It's called Cuba. And what had happened, of course, was that there had been a revolution on that island. And there was all kinds of reasons for a revolution. And a man named Fidel Castro came to power with the help of another man called Che Guevara, who was from Argentina, was a doctor's son. And all that could be blamed on Castro wasn't true. Castro was a middle-class person. His father was a doctor. They were not dirt poor revolutionaries. They were middle-class people. And he and his brother took charge. It was a little difficult at first because we were involved deeply in the Cuban politics. And the CIA knew this. So in order to try and undo the bad, the CIA planned a dreadful, dreadful exercise. They went to Guatemala and they got the Guatemalans to agree to put together a force of ex-revolutionaries that they could depend on to invade Cuba and throw the Castro brothers out. So we have the famous Bay of Pigs, another CIA bungle. This one was so bad that Kennedy felt he had to fire the head of the CIA. That happened to be Allen Dulles, which was very bad news for those Dulles brothers. And if you don't know it, the Bay of Pigs was an absolute disaster. The group that was to act there did in fact land and was defeated by Castro. And it was such a thoroughgoing defeat that if you go, as I have many times, to Cuba, you should go to the Bay of Pigs. It's still there. It's on the other side of the island. In the case of the Bay of Pigs, Castro has built a museum to celebrate our defeat at the beach of Bay of Pigs. And he's put on display all the American equipment that was captured. So we not only had to suffer the initial defeat, but we, every day, even today, you can go to the Bay of Pigs and look at all the captured American equipment that is still there from the famous Kennedy attempt to overthrow. And then why should you be surprised? The Castro brothers didn't believe he would give up. So what did they do? Well, we go back to the KGB again. The KGB had a very famous group of people working in their inside group. One of the members of the inner circle was a man named Suslov. And Suslov kept yelling to Khrushchev that he should not have anything to do with this business because the Castro people and the Cuban people had not gone through all the steps necessary to be inside of a revolution. You have to have a proletariat. They didn't have a proletariat, they just have poor dirt sugar crop raisers. Khrushchev was not interested in this kind of political talk. He saw a chance to increase Soviet power at a very little investment. So why should you be surprised that after we attempted to invade the island and we failed, that Cuba would not suspect that we would try again? So instead of waiting for another blow to fall, Castro invited Mr. Khrushchev to introduce a missile or two, and then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you have the CIA involved again because the CIA wanted heavy evidence of everything. So a couple of things occurred. Years ago, you were probably very happy here in California and never went over to Moffett Air Force Base. It's right across the bay. But in Moffett, there used to be a very long, slinky plane. Only had room for one, the pilot. It's called a U-2. The CIA had decided they would build a special airplane that could fly higher and faster than anyone could shoot it down. And they had gone first to a little place down in called the Skunk Works. It's part of an airline system that develops airline pilots. And they said, we want you to build us an airplane that can fly higher than any airplane can fly today and faster than any airplane can. And the people of the Skunk Works, which is Lockheed, said, I'm sorry, but we can't do that. It's beyond our abilities. And the CIA always has a key word. Money is no object. And so, of course, they said, oh, we can do that. We can certainly do that. And so they built the CIA. They built the U-2. Then the same CIA group went to a little place called, it's in upstate New York. It's where Kodak is located. Builds cameras. They said, we want you to build us a camera that can see from 50,000 feet through the window in the Kremlin and photograph the documents on the desk behind that window. And the people in Kodak said, that's not possible. We just, it's beyond our technology. And the CIA answer was, money is no object. And guess what? Kodak said, we can do that. And they did. So suddenly you had the airframe, and you had the camera, place only for one guy, the pilot, and it flew. It usually flew from Shikoku in Japan when it wanted to fly over Red China, or it flew from Udon in Thailand when it had to fly over the Soviet heartland, and it looked like it was fine. It kept bringing back wonderful photographs where you could see everything that you would want to see that was going on inside these hostile countries. The problem was, sooner or later, you're bound to have a problem. And it was a time when there was a man named Gary Powers who went into Southern Asia to fly a U-2 over the central part of the Soviet Union. which was, of course, illegal to do, but you would always be able to deny. In fact, they had a very strange rule at the CIA that if you got caught, you had a needle in your boot, and you just stuck yourself with a needle and you're dead. So all they got is a dead body. And there'll be nothing on you, no identification, no driver's license, no Kaiser ID for your hospitalization, nothing. So everything looked like, all right, U-2s were flying, U-2s were flying, U-2s were flying. And then Gary Powers flew, and in Gary's, there was always a technical problem with the plane. When you go up to 50,000 feet, you're flying in very, very thin oxygen, almost none. And so the likelihood, possibility, is that you will flame out. When you do that, in order to start the engine again, you have to come down from 50,000 feet to like 20,000 or 25 or 30 and get the engine started and climb back up. And it happened that Gary Powers flamed out. So he followed instructions, came down, and then started his engines and started up. The problem was the Soviets might be slow and they might be dumb, but they're not stupid. And so they were tracking constantly all these illegal flights over their territory. And when they saw this one come down low within range of their rocket forces, the rocket forces fired and they hit. So Gary Powers is now down. He comes down and crashes. Things are really unhappy out at CIA headquarters in Langley. And somebody has to go to the White House and tell the President of the United States what had happened. And so we go to the White House. And we make up Mr. Eisenhower, who sleeps very late. Eisenhower was quite old at this time. He'd already had one heart attack. And they briefed him and said, not to worry. He couldn't have survived the crash to begin with. He's been knocked out of the sky at something like 35,000 feet, and the crash alone will have killed him. If not, he has a needle in his boot. All he has to do is reach down and shoot himself with the needle, and he will be dead. And so you couldn't survive, but if you accidentally survived, you could kill yourself. And on top of that, there is no identification on the plane. There's no identification on the body. So we are in the clear. Oh me, oh my. So we, of course, alerted everybody to deny that we had anything to do with it. And we kept denying it, and we kept denying it, and the Soviets kept charging it. Soviets were very good. They often walked out on the UN, banging first on the table and then leaving. But now they had not walked out. And there was a man there named Adlai Stevens who said he would deny it till the day he died. Well, the problem was Gary Powers had not died. Gary Powers had lived and had been captured by the Soviets. And so suddenly, there's an announcement to all the local press, NBC, CBS, Agence Française, the German press, the English press, of a news conference. And then we went to the news conference, and out walked Gary Powers. He was alive. He was obviously frightened, and he said who he was and what had happened. So then there was lots of things to be explained back at Langley. Now we had already fired one person at Langley. That was the man who'd given us the Bay of Pigs. And now we're going to have to fire some more people because the President of the United States is not happy. He would promise one thing and something else happened. And so it's necessary, if you've known to hear the Soviet KGB has set somebody up to kill the Pope and the guy misses. That's already an embarrassment. Now we have this mess with Gary Powers and he lives, which is also an embarrassment. So over and over again, these two agencies lock horns in ways that are very difficult, and since those days have long gone now, we have instead lost a little bit of the trackage we've got, because in the case of the people that are involved today, Mr. Putin, he is a member. That's where he was trained. That's where he knows it's how he thinks. When it comes to how to handle an enemy, you think in the terms of the KGB, hire someone to kill him. There have been all these attempts that have been to kill people. You get somebody to go and walk beside somebody who's living in the West now, and you stab him in the leg, and it's a poison and he dies. Not a very nice business to be involved in. And so we have got to that point, and you might think, well, we would never do anything. Like, goodness knows we. Are you aware that a former president of the United States was, before he was president of the United States, the head of the CIA? His last name is Bush. The one that's too dumb to have been the CIA is the one they call Junior. But the other one was not dumb, and he was the man in charge. And that's why it was always surprising to people when he said he didn't know what was going on in Panama, when he was the man who set the Panamanian leader up to be the drug dealer. In order to catch a drug dealer, you sometimes need to use a drug dealer. And now we're going to arrest the drug dealer we were working with and blow him out of the saddle. Not good times. The CIA and the KGB, two of the major institutions of foreign policy, at a time when things are not looking good for us. We hope that most of those things are gone today, although we sometimes worry. We worry, for instance, that for some reason Mr. Biden is not willing to undo the damage that was done to Cuba. Let me give you a shocking bit of news. The Cubans know exactly what they're doing. The Cubans celebrated the Castro brothers. The Cubans, under the Castro regime, in the first initial years, literacy was extremely low. Today, literacy is very high. Almost everyone can read and write, and also graduate university. Healthcare was almost non-available. I remember going to Cuba and finding that we were punishing them for having brought the Castros to power, so we didn't allow anybody to trade with them. They couldn't even import aspirin. But they learned how to train doctors and nurses, and today they have the best medical care system in Central and South America, and they export doctors and nurses to the countries of Central and South America so that they can have good health care. So both their education standards and their medical standards are very high. So we should maybe leave them alone. Just because they don't like us, why don't they like us? Well, we tried to invade them, the Bay of Pigs. That wasn't some made-up story, that was a true story. They have the southern side of their island, which is a wonderful place to go for fishing, swimming, and there's a museum there that's open, it's free. And what is it about? It's about the Bay of Pigs and all the American equipment that was captured on their island that was brought there by us. You think you're going to get a rose bouquet? It's been a strong and long struggle. These two agencies, in many cases, have been part of the problem. We never had a CIA before. We got one in 1947 with the National Defense Act. It has been a major institution of governance. It uses a great deal of money, much of it under the auspices of other agencies, so you can't find its budget. And it's of some value to note that some people are very much opposed to having a CIA, just as was Harry Truman when he got rid of the OSS and said we didn't need it. Or back in the days when very famous New Englanders said, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. Well, we've turned out to believe that the other gentlemen are not gentlemen, but maybe we are not either. And so this thing leads you to many complications. A great friend of mine who has written a wonderful book called Blowback. His name is Chalmers Johnson, and the Chal is probably the greatest East Asianist we've ever had at Berkeley. And in Blowback, he maintains that all these things come back to haunt you. That you have an operation run by the CIA, but later the fallout comes back as blowback. People are not dumb. They realize these various things are happening and that the cause of it is the Americans. So you might want to keep that in mind when you perceive that this is always good. I recommend you might read Blowback, and you'd find it a very interesting way to look at the past as it did occur. But I've now noticed that the clock is now ticking. And I think that Renata wants to talk to me about an upcoming film anyway. So I will let you go, and I'll see you next week, same time, same place.